speaker. Our speaker is Jennifer Lynch. So the question is often asked rhetorically, who watches the watchers? And today, after millennia asking that question, I can actually answer it. So the answer is Jennifer Lynch. Jen Lynch is an attorney at the Electronic Frontier Foundation based in San Francisco. EFF is the leading civil liberties group for the information age. So it's worried about the ways that civil liberties are being exercised online and jeopardized online. And so this is the new mode of civic engagement. And so the EFF is particularly concerned about this. And when I say online, I don't mean to just say things that happen in cyberspace. I also need to include all the ways that the digital medium is enabling civic participation or potentially jeopardizing our liberties in our civic engagement. Jennifer is an attorney who has been at the forefront of litigating cases, finding out what's actually happening as our government surveillance apparatus is increasing in this technological age through biometric scans, face recognition, through license plate readers. We just talked about a case in which she's arguing soon, that is soon to be heard at the Supreme Court of California about automated license plate readers that are out there capturing your car as it travels down the road or is parked. I ran my own plate through one of these databases recently in Oakland and found, voila, there I am on February 17th at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Here's my car on College Street in Oakland, identified, etc. So this is happening, and there's an incredible amount that's going on that we didn't even know. So I was actually stunned to see that my movements in Oakland are being tracked by the police. It can be and we go back historically and find out where I was 2.5 years ago in Oakland, right? Quite stunning developments, and I'm delighted to welcome Ms. Lynch. She is a graduate of Berkeley. She has an undergraduate degree from Berkeley and also a law degree from Berkeley. She worked at a law firm. Bingham McCutcheon in San Francisco, and she clerked for Judge Knatz on the Central District of California. It's my delight to welcome her here.
Hi. Everybody hear me okay? So thanks. This is a great full room. I'm really excited to be here. And I just had a great discussion with the class beforehand and cover a little bit of that and also talk about some other things that are going on at EFF. So for those of you who don't know, the Electronic Frontier Foundation has been around for 25 years now. We've been dedicated to protecting privacy and civil liberties and new technologies for all of that time. And we're kind of a unique organization because we're made up of a few different groups of people. We have lawyers like me on staff who litigate cases, who talk to Congress and state legislatures about what are appropriate laws to protect privacy and civil liberties. But we also have activists and we have technologists on staff. And our technologists not only explain how the technology works to the lawyers on the team, but they also design their own privacy-enhancing technologies. So we have a tool called HTTPS Everywhere that automatically routes your browser to a secure and encrypted site. If there's an HTTPS alternative for a site, then you have this browser extension and your website will go there, and all of your data will be encrypted as it travels over the web. So it's a great place to work. I really enjoyed it, and I've been there for about 5 years. Today I'm going to talk about maintaining democracy in a 24/7 surveillance society. I think we're entering a new era in society where technologies can monitor us throughout most of our lives. And so how do we preserve the democracy that we've always enjoyed in the United States while still living in this kind of a society. So this is what I'm going to cover today. First start by talking about privacy and democracy. What does that really mean? And then a little bit about the Fourth Amendment. We're obviously in a law school, and I don't know how many of you have gone into depth about the Fourth Amendment, but you'll hear a little bit more about it today. The four biggest changes that we've seen in domestic law enforcement since 9/11, what some of these 24/7 surveillance technologies are, how the Fourth Amendment impacts other rights that we have in the United States, and finally, what does this mean for the future? So I want to start out with the premise that democracy requires privacy. We cannot live in a democracy without having privacy. And I'll elaborate on this as the talk goes on, but hopefully by the end of the talk, that's what I want you all to appreciate, that this is what we need in society. So first we need a common understanding of what privacy actually means, because the word privacy is not in the United States Constitution, but it's widely accepted as a fundamental human right. So one of the first times that privacy came up in the United States court system was Justice Brandeis's dissent in a wiretapping case called Olmstead in 1928. And he described privacy as the right to keep secrets or to be left alone. But it's also the right to talk about and shape our beliefs without fear that someone we don't know is listening to us. And that really comes down to being able to control the information about you and where it goes and how it's spread. Who is it shared with? So that's really what privacy is. It's about making the ability to make choices about the information about you. And of course, it's a balance, because we live in a society where we hang out with other people and we share information about ourselves all the time. So privacy cannot be total secrecy. We can't have to say that the only way that you get privacy is if you keep your information completely secret. Because the only way that we can shape our ideas about how the world should be around us is by talking to other people and sharing our lives with other people. So what is surveillance? So surveillance is based on a French word that means to watch over. Surveillance, a French word. And David Lyon, he's a Canadian professor of sociology who focuses on surveillance studies, and he describes surveillance as the focused, systemic, and routine attention to personal details for purposes of influence, management, protection, or direction. In his mind, surveillance isn't always a bad thing. We're going to talk today, or I'm going to talk today, a little bit about the not so great aspects of surveillance, but in his mind it could be for good or for bad. But basically surveillance is deliberate, it's not random collection of information, and it also can be something that becomes routine, it becomes a normal part of our daily lives. So what has traditionally protected us from government watching? Well, our constitutional rights, and mainly the Fourth Amendment. So the Fourth Amendment does three things. It protects specific things, it lays out specific things for protection: peoples, houses, papers, and effects. The second thing it does is that it prohibits unreasonable searches and seizures, and the key word there is unreasonable, not all searches, just unreasonable ones. And then it requires warrants. So those warrants must be based on probable cause, they need to be supported by an oath that particularly describes the place to be searched and the things to be seized. And the Fourth Amendment was drafted specifically as a reaction to what was happening, what the British government was doing to the colonists in the times before the War of Independence. So the British government could issue these things called general warrants, or writs of assistance. These were things that were proclamations signed by the king that said, there's this bad thing going on, there's this seditious behavior going on, somebody is publishing something against the British government, and you have the right, you British officers have the right to go into anybody's house and look for anything that you want that might be able to rout out this seditious behavior. It didn't matter if the person who owned that house or that shop was somehow tied to, say, the printing press that was publishing the information. This writ of assistance said that the British officers had the right to go in any house that they wanted. And the crazy thing about it was that it wasn't limited in time. It actually lasted the life of the king, so it lasted for decades. So we ended up with the Fourth Amendment, specifically drafted by James Madison as a reaction to the general warrants. But the issue is, how do you apply this 18th century rule? This is what the world looked like back then. Luckily, we don't all wear wigs anymore. To 21st century technology. And the courts are struggling with this today. So in a case called U.S. versus Jones, that was a 2012 case that dealt with a GPS tracking device that was put onto a car, Justice Alito, in his concurring opinion, said, we must assure the preservation of that degree of privacy against government that existed when the Fourth Amendment was adopted. But it's almost impossible to think of late 18th century situations that are analogous to the 24/7 GPS surveillance that happened in the Jones case. So the question is, how do you go from privacy in this, persons, houses, papers, and effects, protecting those from unreasonable searches and seizures, to privacy in this, where we have our email, our web searches, our social media, license plate tracking? How does that map onto a person, a house, a paper, or an effect? Well, getting back to the Fourth Amendment, I think we need to start with an understanding of what that really means. Like I said, it prohibits unreasonable searches. So the default rule in the Fourth Amendment is that government searches that are conducted without a warrant are per se unreasonable. So we start from this position. Does the government have a warrant to get access to that information? No, they're per se unreasonable, and the government has to show why that search is still a reasonable search. A warrant, like I said, needs to particularly describe the thing to be searched, the place to be searched, and the thing to be seized. And it also needs to be based on probable cause to believe that the search will turn up contraband or evidence of a crime. So a law enforcement officer has to go to a judge and say, this is what I have found out so far in my investigation, and this is why I think I should be able to go into this person's house and search their house. And the judge says, you have shown enough information, stamp, you get your warrant, or the judge might say, you haven't proved enough, shown enough evidence to support probable cause, you don't get your warrant. But really we have to go back to what is a search. So traditionally, a search was an actual physical invasion of a space or a person. It is, I go into your house, I pat your person down. But how does that map to our phone conversations, to our email? Well, in 1967, we had a case called Katz, and in that case, the court held it was a wiretapping case where Mr. Katz was trying to place bets in a public phone booth, and the cops wanted to tap into the phone line, and the Supreme Court said, well, actually, the Fourth Amendment protects people, not places. So even though Mr. Katz had no ownership interest in that public phone booth where he was placing his bets, and he certainly didn't own the phone line, so he couldn't prevent anybody from putting anything on the phone line. The real issue was the communication that he was placing. And that's what the law enforcement officers wanted. They wanted to get evidence from his phone calls. And so the Fourth Amendment protects that communication, not just the phone line, the physical phone line, or the phone booth. So one of the things that came up in the Katz case is, well, how do you decide what is a reasonable or unreasonable search? Justice Harlan had a concurring opinion in that case that became very, very famous, and he said that you determine if a search is reasonable based on whether somebody has a reasonable expectation of privacy in the information that you're trying to seek. And that's a twofold requirement. You need to show that the person has a subjective expectation of privacy. I don't think that you should have access to my information. But it also needs to be an expectation that society understands as reasonable. So does everybody else think in society, or a majority of people in society, think that law enforcement shouldn't have access to my email? So that's this reasonable expectation of privacy. But there are a couple problems that we run into as technology advances, and that is, as we learn more about government surveillance and what's possible, for example, now that I know that Google is tracking my web searches and that law enforcement can get access to that, do I still have a reasonable expectation of privacy in that? Does the reasonable expectation of privacy change as our understanding of what's possible with technology also changes? And also, what happens if we share information about ourselves with others but not with the government? So these are tough questions that the courts are struggling with today. Now I wanted to move on to 4 of the biggest changes that we've seen in domestic law enforcement since 9/11. So the first is this move from solving crime to protecting national security and fighting terrorism. I'm going to talk about each of these a little bit more in detail in a sec. The second is that sophisticated technologies are getting cheaper and easier to use. We've also seen blurred borders between public and private data collection. And finally, mass surveillance is now possible for just about any law enforcement agency. So, move from solving crime to protecting national security. This has clearly happened since 9/11, where we've had this shifting focus from fighting crime, solving crime after the fact, to intelligence gathering, where we're encouraging local law enforcement agencies to go out and collect information on people because those people might be involved in terrorist activities. But we're not actually providing adequate training on what that actually means to do that. And what it has meant is that now protecting national security has led to more invasive technologies and more data collection and more sharing of that data across different agencies. So as technology gets cheaper and easier to use, even small local law enforcement agencies can access sophisticated surveillance technologies. We've seen this with automated license plate cameras that I'll talk a little bit more about, and I think Saruz talked about them last week, where just about any law enforcement agency now can purchase automated license plate cameras that can collect information on any car that drives by. They do that with Homeland Security grants, with private grants from police organizations. But they're accessible, and we've seen this with not just license plate cameras, but also with drones, handheld biometric collection tools, GPS tracking devices. You can buy a GPS tracking device on the internet for about $50 if you wanted to illegally track somebody. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about these technologies in a minute. But it means that we're giving law enforcement agencies this increased technological capacity to collect, store, and search and combine and share data with each other. So we're also having this blurred border between public and private data collection, blurring between public or government surveillance and private or corporate surveillance. So you can think about this as the web beacons that are downloaded onto your computer when you're doing searches on the internet, and they're tracking you every place you go. And so they're saying, well, you know, Jennifer's on Facebook, and then she went to the Bloomingdale catalog website and looked at towels, but she didn't buy towels, and then she went to the New York Times website, and all of those different websites have the same web beacon on them. And so I get to the New York Times website, and it says, hey, would you like to buy these beautiful towels? They're available at Bloomingdale's. So that's a form of surveillance that's going on. It's following my web tracking. It's not necessarily going to the government yet, but what's to prevent it from going to the government? And there is a lot of sharing of data between the government and private companies. And this all means that mass surveillance is possible for any police department, because as these technologies get cheaper and easier to use, and as more and more data is collected by both private and government entities, it's much more possible to surveil the public, collect information on just about everybody. So moving on to some of the 24/7 surveillance technologies that we've been seeing at EFF. We have now seen technology that can allow for surreptitious surveillance and tracking where you don't know that it's even going on, and also technology that enhances the capacity to store, share, and analyze data. So the sophisticated collection devices like I've been talking about with GPS and drones are also reliant on the fact that data storage is getting cheaper and cheaper, exponentially cheaper every year. So it becomes much easier to hold on to data for long periods of time. And that means that you can collect information on people and search it for a long time in the past. It also makes it a lot easier to share data across government agencies. And with this kind of data storage and sophisticated analytical tools on the back end, you can look for patterns that you wouldn't have been able to find in the past. So has this person gone to this BART station every day for the last year at this particular time? And when they didn't go to that BART station, is there a reason why we should be suspicious? So I think that the most obvious technological advance we've seen has been in cameras. You see this on your cell phone. If you had an iPhone, one of the first generation iPhones, and you look at what your pictures looked like from that iPhone just 10 years ago, compared to the pictures you're able to collect with your iPhone 6 today, it's a huge difference. It's a huge difference in how detailed they are, how much you can drill down in specific details. And this doesn't just happen on consumer devices. This is, of course, happening on security camera systems as well. So where in the past we had security cameras that were pretty grainy, they took maybe a photo every second, now they're going on continuously. They're also linked to one another. So if a person moves from one camera location to another camera location, you can track them as they go along a public street. If you think about areas like Lower Manhattan, they have about 3,000 surveillance cameras in Lower Manhattan that are all linked to these kinds of command centers, where one person can see what's going on. And they're also linked to the license plate cameras, they're linked to DMV data, they're linked to mugshot databases. All of that information is available to law enforcement officers. And the other thing is that technology on the back end is getting smarter. So we now have behavioral detection technology that can look for specific things that somebody has decided is evidence of suspicious behavior. So for example, did somebody leave something on a train station platform and walk away? Is there a car that's circling a building more than once? Is there somebody who's going in through an exit door when they should be going in through an entrance door? And these systems look for that kind of behavior, and then they'll alert an officer to look into that. The other thing that you can do with these systems is that they can be taught to recognize familiar faces. This was something that actually started in casinos where they were trying to catch card counters. And they train their face recognition systems to look for a specific face and then find every time that face showed up in the casino in the past. And then the system would alert when that person showed up. So now these kinds of technologies are also in our surveillance systems. Drones have been pretty big in the news. Law enforcement agencies are very interested in purchasing drones because they're not very expensive, and you can fly them and collect images with them for not a lot of money. If you think about a law enforcement agency that has a small budget, even San Francisco Police Department doesn't have enough money to buy a helicopter, but they have more than enough money to buy several drones and fly those drones at any time they want. Any kind of surveillance technology that exists, you can put on a drone, whether it's a camera, that's sort of the most common, but you can also put on technology that sniffs out communications or collects cell phone information. Most of them have night vision or infrared vision. And there are no consistent standards with drones to protect privacy. So really the only thing that's preventing law enforcement agencies around the country from flying drones right now is the fact that they can't get a license from the Federal Aviation Administration. But as soon as the FAA has worked out that problem, we will see many more law enforcement agencies with drones. Face recognition I've talked about a little bit. Just in the last year, the FBI went online with its massive face recognition database. So now it has a system for collecting all of the mugshot photos that are taken at the state level or at the federal level, and putting those into its face recognition database and using those to identify people. We're also seeing this use of mobile or handheld devices where an officer out on the street can stop a person and say, hey, I want to take your picture. Maybe that officer has reasonable suspicion to stop the person, but maybe the officer just says, hey, I want to take your picture, and you think, well, this guy just stopped me, so you must have the right to do that, right? And you say, okay. And there you're just giving consent to have your picture taken and put into a face recognition database. So face recognition is concerning because it can be captured without your knowledge and from a distance, and it can be captured in public and on a mass scale. So it's more concerning than many other biometric technologies. Like if you think about fingerprints, you pretty much know if you're having your fingerprint collected because you have to get your fingerprint either on a fingerprint reader or very close to it. But your face could just be collected when you're walking around in public. And the FBI has said that they just want to collect pictures for mugshot images. But this image over here, this crowd photo, was taken from an FBI presentation at a biometrics conference in 2010. And the whole point of this presentation was to discuss the fact that the FBI wanted to use the face recognition system to track people as they move from place to place. This is a picture of one political rally and another political rally with the idea that you're trying to find the person who's moving from one to the next. So we've also seen automated license plate readers. I think for those of you who were here last week, you probably heard more from Saruz about that. We have a case right now against the Los Angeles Police Department and the LA Sheriff's Department to get access to license plate information like Saruz got, but we want a week's worth of data on a specific date and time. We actually picked the final week of Ramadan in 2012 just to see if there was any extensive surveillance going on in Muslim communities. And the LAPD and the LA Sheriffs have denied access to that data, but we have learned a few things as a result of the lawsuit. One of the things we learned is that between the two agencies, they are scanning 3 million license plates every week. And they're storing that data for 2 to 5 years, so they have a database of about 500 million license plate records at this time. And that's information not just on what the plate is, but also when and where it was photographed. And with that information, you can use it to not only say where somebody was in the past, but predict where they might be in the future. Other location tracking technology includes GPS tracking devices on cars, our cell phones. This device down in the corner is called a Stingray, and that's a tool that law enforcement officers can use to collect information on all the cell phones in a specific region. So every time your cell phone pings a cell phone tower to say, send me information, or I want to send you information to somebody else, Stingray will say, route that signal through this device instead. It acts like a cell tower, and then they can find the unique identifying information for all phones in the region, whether or not those phones have anything to do with crime. So all of these devices that I've been talking about collect something that's sort of loosely termed metadata. We heard a little bit about metadata when Edward Snowden released a lot of information on the NSA. And metadata, I think, is pretty important to understand today because of the way the Fourth Amendment impacts the collection of metadata. So, unlike the content of your communications, like what's inside a letter that you might send to somebody, metadata is actually like the address on the outside of your letter. And it's traditionally not been given Fourth Amendment protection because it hasn't been thought that people felt like that information was very private. You know, if you're sharing it with a third party or letting the Postal Service see it on the outside of your letter, then you can't actually be thinking that that's private information. So metadata is the data about the data. It's not traditionally considered content, like I said, who we send a letter to rather than what's in the letter, the phone numbers we dial, our bank account information, the people we email, where we go, and when. But metadata can become a proxy for content, so you can actually learn quite a lot from metadata. For example, the specific numbers that we dial can reveal much about what the communication was that occurred. So if you think about specific numbers like hotline, whether it's a government, a federal agency whistleblower hotline, or a domestic violence hotline, or a gay and lesbian teen hotline, or a veterans hotline, a suicide hotline, all of these, if you just call that number, it's pretty clear that you have some sort of an interest or concern that's related to that specific subject matter. And then how much time you spend on that call can tell a lot about what your relationship is to that subject matter. And the ordered calls may tell a story. So let's say a woman calls her gynecologist, and then she calls her mom, and then she calls a man who she's been talking to quite extensively over the last few months, and then she calls the family planning clinic. That series of calls hasn't told me anything about what she talked about during those calls, but just having that series of calls tells quite a lot. So we can learn a lot from metadata because even if the individual pieces of data are not that revealing, the woman calls her mom, that's not that revealing. In the aggregate, it tells you quite a lot about what's going on. It's also impossible to avoid generating metadata and leaving it behind. You can't erase metadata once it's already been generated. So you can learn all of these things from metadata. I talked about this a little bit before. Who you know, how you know them, how long you've known them, who they know, your political and religious beliefs. Are you calling the Democratic Party to make a donation? Are you calling your pastor to talk about something at the church? Your health information, are you calling your doctor, and what kind of doctor is it? Is it an oncologist? Where you've been, where you're going, and ultimately who you are. So I think it's very hard to understand data collection and how it impacts our lives without visualizing it. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to get license plate information from the two agencies in LA. I want to be able to map that information and say to people, this is why we should be concerned about surveillance, because this is what it can tell us. So call detail records are the information. It's not the content of your call, but it's everything else. It's who you called, when you called them, how long you talked to them, and then the unique number that identifies your phone. So this is something the NSA has been collecting on us since 2006, but local law enforcement agencies are interested in this as well, and AT&T has been collecting this information since 1987. But what can you do with this information? Well, you can take a social network analysis tool like this one here, and you can map connections. So you can say not only who a person is associated with, did this person call that person, but you can also see how close that person is to various others in the network. How are people linked to each other? Who has the most influence in the network? And who controls the information flow? You can also do this with email metadata. So right after the Snowden releases happened, some researchers at MIT developed this tool called Immersion. And if you wanted to see what the NSA could learn about you from your email metadata, you could download this tool, Immersion, give it access to your Gmail metadata, and it would show you what the NSA can see. So I did this, which I don't advise anybody doing. But it mapped all of my email metadata from 2005, when I first started using Gmail. And it painted a picture of who was most important in my life between 2005 and I think, whatever it is, 2013. And it also mapped those people's connections to each other. So, and I didn't tell it to do any of this. It just went in and did its own thing. So you can see everybody in red over here on the side. Those are all my family members. It was able to map those connections and figure out that those people should somehow be related to each other based on who was CC'd on emails and who emailed somebody else. And then you can drill down and look at specific people. So this was the person who was the largest circle in the center of the last image. You can see what their relationship was to other people in my personal network. You can also see not just how he's connected to other people, but also who did he introduce me to, and when did he first email me. You can see there's a graph on the side that shows when did we email each other the most frequently. You can also figure out when did you stop emailing somebody. So location data is also particularly revealing, and it's so uniquely identifying that some people consider it to be biometric information. This is your pathway through life. If you think about this, nobody else travels the same pathway through life as you do. And even with the variations in our pathways, they are distinctive to us. Some researchers a couple years ago proved this point by looking at location information for about 1.5 million people. And they determined that with just 4 randomly generated data points, this was where is the person on this particular time and date. With just 4 randomly generated points, you could identify uniquely 95% of the population. That's an incredible amount, and not that much information. And you think about how much information is collected on us these days for location information, using our cell phones. It's pretty easy to identify people. So one of my friends is a chief scientist at IBM, and he said these two things that got me interested in location data. We gave a talk at South by Southwest on this, where he gave the science background, and I talked about why we should be concerned. But I think this shows you, the same thing can't be in two places at the same time. It's sort of obvious. Two different things can't occupy the same space at the same time, but this is why location information is so sensitive. So where does it come from? Well, cell towers, GPS, black boxes that are in your car, license plate cameras, stingrays. And how is it possible to collect all this information? Well, these are two maps showing the cell towers near my office in San Francisco, and the cell towers right around this area here in Davis. You can see there are way more cell towers within a mile of my office in DFS than there are here in Davis. So lucky you guys. The more cell towers there are, the easier it is to distinctly pinpoint a person's actual location. So what does it look like when law enforcement gets this information? Well, this is a case called U.S. versus Graham that the Fourth Circuit just heard and decided this past August. And in this case, the law enforcement officers were able to get access to 221 days of cell site location records without a warrant. And in those 221 days, they were able to get access to nearly 30,000 distinct location points. That's an average of 100 data points every day. Not just on Mr. Graham, but also on his co-conspirator. The Fourth Circuit just determined that this data was so sensitive that they should have gotten a warrant for it. Not good for Mr. Graham because they said that that didn't actually matter for that case. This is another case that we've been tracking and working on, People versus the State of New York versus against Malawi. And in this case, the cops in New York were investigating burglaries that occurred on 6 specific days. They knew when those burglaries happened, but they actually were able to get 6 months of Mr. Malawi's cell site location information without a warrant. This revealed about 10,400 data points, one location point approximately every hour. And the New York Civil Liberties Union took this information and mapped it for one specific week. Now this map represents one day, and you can see with this, so you can see point A is here in the middle. That's where Mr. Malawi lives. He spent a certain amount of time at his house, and then he went out to point B, which is Stony Brook University, spent some time there, drove back to his house, hung out there for a little bit longer, and then drove all the way down here to point C, which is where his fiance lives, and he spent the night there. We know all of that information. The government got all of that information without a warrant. This is something else you can do with location information. Some researchers at Berkeley and MIT were doing some research on why is there so much traffic in the Bay Area. So they got access to cell phone records, just the call detail information, for about 360,000 San Francisco Bay Area residents. They have said that they have anonymized this data, but as you can see, hopefully from the talk so far, it's impossible to anonymize it. They say that they're not going to share it with anybody, but how do we know that it won't be hacked? And all of that information could be available to the public. So why are all these technologies concerning? Why do we think that surveillance in a democracy is harmful? And there are 2 main reasons. One is that it can chill the exercise of other civil liberties. People might be afraid to speak out on social issues of the day. And it also shifts the power dynamic from the watched to the watcher, from citizens to the government. And that's just not how our government was set up. And you can think about what the impact would be on society if the government had had these sophisticated surveillance technologies in the past. Where would we be on gay rights? Where would we be on women's suffrage, segregation, even the formation of the United States if the government were able to figure out who's talking to who, what they're talking about, and where they're going, and put pressure on people to not engage in some activities that might be against the government, that might actually even be illegal at the time when it happened. It's very difficult to have change in society if you can't talk freely about the things that you don't like in society. So the problem is, getting back to the Fourth Amendment, that traditionally courts have held that the Fourth Amendment doesn't protect things that we expose to the public or share with third parties. Because, like I said before, how can you feel that that information is private if you're sharing it or exposing it to the public? This is based on old cases that looked at landline phone calls, cases that looked at an airplane flying over your backyard for one single flight, cases that looked at the trash that you left behind on a public street. So how does that all map onto what's going on with technology today? But nevertheless, these cases are still in the law of the land in most cases, and courts are struggling with how to apply them to the situations that we have today. So how does the Fourth Amendment impact other rights? Well, surveillance and the failure of law enforcement to follow and courts to enforce our Fourth Amendment rights diminishes other rights, and most specifically our First Amendment rights, because it creates a chilling effect on speech and how we want to practice religion and even who we want to associate with. So the First Amendment protects our right to practice the religion of our choice, prohibits laws that abridge free speech and a free press, and also prohibits laws that restrict the ability of people to gather together to talk about things that are going on in their lives. It protects a few specific values. The most important is the ability to talk about public issues of the day. That's sort of the foundation of the First Amendment. It protects the freedom of association. The Supreme Court has held that the government can't ask people about their membership in organizations without a compelling state interest. And it doesn't matter if the organization or the association is political. It can also be set up to discuss religious or cultural matters, or even who you think that your favorite movie star is. And then the First Amendment also prohibits laws that create a chilling effect on speech. So this means, is the law going to deter people from speaking? Is it going to mean that people are less likely to engage in political debate or associate with people who they don't know? And we've actually seen this happen. So after it came out that the New York Police Department and the FBI were surveilling Muslim communities in New York and New Jersey, some researchers went out into the communities and asked people, what did they think about the surveillance? How did it impact their lives? And the stories were pretty chilling because people actually changed their behavior because they knew they were being watched. And this happened where storekeepers who might in the past have had Al Jazeera playing on the TV station in their store were either turning that TV off entirely or turning it to a station that might be less suspect with the government. People were not going to specific mosques if they felt like there was radical behavior going on in that mosque. They were not welcoming new people into the community because that person might be an informant. And parents were actually telling their children not to engage in political speech for fear that that would bring attention to their families. So the First Amendment also allows for anonymity, and this, of course, lessens the chilling effect because if people are able to speak anonymously without feeling like the government knows who they are, they may be more willing to say things that they wouldn't if they thought the government was watching. So how do these things play out in society today? Well, I think we need to keep looking to the past to understand what has happened or could happen in the future. So some of these abuses in the past, we tend to forget how bad the NSA and the FBI, the CIA were in the past. Operation Shamrock happened between 1947 and 75, and the government was monitoring millions of telegrams sent by Americans during that time. It's kind of like the NSA program today because they partnered with the 3 major telegraph companies that sent all foreign-bound telegraphs from the United States. So the NSA in the last 2 years of the program, they were reviewing about 150,000 telegraphs every month. And it's kind of funny to think that in 75 people were still sending telegraphs. But when Congress found out about the program, Senator Frank Church, who chaired the Intelligence Committee at the time, described it as the largest government interception program affecting Americans that has ever been undertaken. Project Minaret, which happened in the 60s and 70s, surveilled the messages of 1,700 Americans, including Supreme Court Justice, Martin Luther King, Muhammad Ali, Senator Adlai Stevenson, Jane Fonda, lots and lots of journalists, teachers, and writers. And then perhaps the most famous was COINTELPRO, which was a J. Ed Hoover program. That was a series of covert and illegal projects where the FBI actually infiltrated groups and collected information on people just for the sole purpose of discrediting them and disrupting domestic political organizations. And that surveillance was based specifically on political beliefs and on people's lifestyles. So now we get to the abuses of today. Law enforcement, we know, has focused surveillance on minority groups based on religion and ethnicity, the Muslim communities that I talked about. But also technology can have a disproportionate impact on minority groups. There's a higher rate of false positives in DNA analysis and face recognition programs with minority groups. And also data collected for one purpose may be used for another, and that may have a disproportionate impact on people. We saw this with a program called Secure Communities a few years ago, a partnership between DHS and FBI, where 3,600 US citizens were caught up in a federal deportation program purely because their data was incorrect. So what does this mean for the future? Well, I think that there is some hope because courts and legislatures are responding to the fact that Fourth Amendment rules are outdated. We've seen changes in a lot of the recent cases where courts have said the Fourth Amendment actually protects your location, information and GPS tracking, email, cell phone searches. But the Fourth Amendment doesn't protect everything, and even though it doesn't, Congress and legislatures can fill in the gaps. And this has also happened in the past. We have some new location privacy laws in the states that require a warrant for location collection. And individual agencies can also institute more protective privacy rules. And I think that this is where we have a role as citizens, because we can put pressure on our local agency to come up with privacy protective rules. This is the place where citizens have the most chance of making change. It's not at Congress, it's with your local police department. So this is also good for law enforcement because the Fourth Amendment limits the use of intrusive tools to cases where there actually is evidence of wrongdoing. It prevents fishing expeditions. And if you have the Fourth Amendment and the First Amendment working together, they actually improve security because they focus law enforcement resources on actual criminal activity, not activity that the police just don't like. And all of this makes the police more effective because the real strength of the Fourth Amendment and other laws limiting surveillance is that it gives citizens confidence in the legality of police activity. We're no longer worried that the police are doing the wrong thing because they are actually following the law. And in that case, we're more likely to cooperate because we know that our data isn't going to be collected for the wrong purpose, used for the wrong purpose. And that helps all of us.